So now I open the question session, and please, you have 1 minute. Introduce yourself and my colleague, Rafał. Can you just help me with the microphones? Thank you. So we have like 20 minutes. Floor is yours. Does anybody has questions, comments? Please. It should work. Yes.
My name is Mohammad John Kabirov. I'm founder of Eurasian Dialogue, registered in Lithuania. Political activist from Tajikistan. Mm-hmm. I really appreciate the organizer of such a good event about political presence in Ukraine and Kazakhstan. And I also encourage to pay more attention toward Tajikistan, because in Tajikistan in past 2 years there was political crackdown on opposition, and we have more than 200 political prisoners. And also the Tajik refugees who stranded on the Polish Ukraine and Polish-Belarus border, especially the case of Tajik activist Majidov Fathuddin, which she is now under the arrest in Ukraine, and her family and his family and 2 kids are based in Poland, and they cannot join each other in past 2 years. So I'm asking the Open Dialog and the other colleagues from Ukraine and also the Polish organization to raise this case. Thank you very much for your side event and attention.
Thank you very much. If you can just afterwards not leave the event and just exchange contacts, it will be much more easier. Okay. Anyone else? Please.
Thank you very much. My name is Zach Rothschild. I'm with the U.S. mission to the OSCE. First of all, I wanted to thank you for organizing this event. It's important to bring such cases to all of our attention, and it's absolutely in line with our responsibility to examine our human dimension commitments here at HDIM. I wanted to ask a question about the experience of Ukrainian anti-corruption activists. Do you think that these incidents are tied to a particular push for a certain kind of reform in Ukraine, or do you think that this is just the kind of the give and take of political and other forces at work in Ukraine? And then also I wanted to ask if, in your experience, there's a certain kind of international advocacy in the other contexts that have been more effective than others in achieving good human rights outcomes in these countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Really, well, first of all, I'm not an anti-corruption activist myself. However, judicial reform is also tied very closely to fight against corruption. I myself am a lawyer, and what we're doing is trying to make judiciary reform and be accountable and effective. And by the way, I'd like to use this opportunity to announce that tomorrow at, sorry, a bit early, but at 8:15 in the morning, we're having also a side event on public participation in the selection of judges in Ukraine in terms of judicial reform. Whoever is interested in that topic, please, we'll be very happy to see you there. Answering your question, there is one NGO in particular in Ukraine which is called Anti-Corruption Action Center that's been very, very, very active in both in terms of developing legislation and pushing that through the government and the parliament, and engaging very closely with the international community that also supported very much politically and technically the reforms in Ukraine. And that was exactly the NGO and the members of that NGO that were harassed in the first place. When that didn't help, that they almost, you can read between the lines in the law that this exact NGO and such NGOs are exactly the scope of these so-called laws on e-declarations for civil activists. And this is exactly because these NGOs, this particular NGO and their partners are responsible for introducing the electronic declaration system that revealed very comprehensive system that revealed huge wealth that is in the hands of members of the parliament or members of the cabinet, which made it very uncomfortable for them, and that made them possibly liable for what do you call it, for illicit enrichment. Second, they're now, and we're together now pushing for establishment of independent anti-corruption courts in Ukraine, which is the last point of the anti-corruption chain, because now to tackle grand corruption in Ukraine, we already have established National Anti-Corruption Bureau, which is extremely effective, and that went after the head of the State Fiscal Service, the several members of the parliament, including one of the most potent and strong who financed one of the two factions of the coalition in large part, several dozen judges, and so on. We have the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecution that also is a newly established anti-corruption body that had prosecutorial oversight over this investigation. But unfortunately, we're still lacking the independent court, which will specifically target grand corruption that will hear these cases. We're undergoing a big and comprehensive judicial reform now, but it will take years before it's effective because of its scope and because of how it is going. More of that tomorrow. But because of their activity, because the government doesn't want that to happen, because it doesn't want anti-corruption courts, and because it doesn't want the system of rule of law that will finally bring the top corruption and those engaged in it to justice, it attacks those who are pushing most actively for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mykhailo. And I will answer for the second part of the question, because actually it's the role of Open Dialogue. We actually do in advocacy to protect concrete people, and it differs from country to country. So, for example, if we speak about Kazakhstan, it is really very effective once you bring attention publicly on different international levels. It works only if you doing joint efforts. So it's diplomats, it's human rights organization, it's media, it's Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe, it's European Parliament, national parliaments of European countries. It's needed to be allowed as much as possible. And in that case, we were able to save life more than 40 people, an activist, oil workers, journalists, oppositioners who were released on the condition. Come on, it's not Ukraine will be able to stop some kind of prosecution, but in Kazakhstan it differs from other Central Asia countries. You are able at least to release person on a condition. It's actually even happens now. Once there was huge pressure on the case of Dzhamilya Aimbetova-Tokmadi, journalist who was, I mentioned him previously, and he was accused of money laundering because actually his connection of alleged connections with main oppositioner Mukhtar Ablyazov. After huge pressure on different international level, he's released nowadays. And actually, we try to do the same. So, but it's a trade, you know. It's you release part of the people, and then regime takes new hostages. That's why we call them often hostages, especially in case of Russia, because Russia did it. It's really like a country terrorist. But in case of Moldova, we were able to release a lot of also activists and to prevent arrest. And actually, Anna, it's one of the bright examples. She is a lawyer, and at the same time, she is a human rights defender, and she can also share her experience, please.
Well, maybe less about my case. I just want to underline about the positive outcomes when we are talking about the international reactions. So, firstly, because the questions was from the representative of United States. In your country is ruling an investigation about the biggest case of money laundering, and lawyers from Russia also know because it's a connected case. 25 billions of American dollars were laundered between using corrupt Moldovan judicial system, captured, in fact, Moldovan judicial system, and the one beneficiary of this was Vladimir Plahotniuk, the person about whom United States knows. And thanks to the investigation which is ruling in your country, we have the hope that we will be able to remove the oligarch from the rule of the country. First, and second, the U.S. State government make a statement recognizing political prisoners in Moldova. Firstly, you were the country which recognized that we in Moldova have political prisoners. The same thing with the positive outcome I can say about the European politician. I see now in the room Mr. Marcin Święcicki, who is a member of Polish parliament. He was a person who was very active in strong and publicly condemnation of political prosecution of different Moldovan oppositioners. And thanks to the reaction of the European parliamentarians, European politicians who weren't afraid to speak frankly about the concrete cases, we really saved lives in Moldova. Since the time I'm here, and I unfortunately cannot go now to my country, but it's another story. And of course, due to a huge pressure which we are making together with the Open Dialog Foundation, within a strategy which was proposed by the Open Dialog Foundation, we were asking on 4 May 2017 in the European Parliament about the freeze, about the to suspend the macrofinancial aid to Moldova, and it was suspended. Well, we were just a part of this action. We understand that not just our ask or our demand work to this result, but we were a small part, and we understand that we could have a result with your involvement, with what you call positive outcome. That's it.
So, any more questions, please? Comments?
Hello, my name is Chris Ravel. I'm with the Canadian delegation and with the Canadian Foreign Ministry. I'd like to echo my American colleagues' thanks for putting on this side event and getting this information out there. I will certainly be taking the information back to colleagues at my headquarters. My question is on Ukraine and the events happening there that you described. Now, there's been a lot of work on security sector reform in Ukraine, a lot of work with policing and whatnot. How much of the problem lies in there, and can some of this be remedied by more work with local level police in terms of recognizing, or is there an influence higher that's working against that kind of security sector reform?
Thank you very much. I'll try to be brief. Well, first, it depends on what kind of police we're talking about. One of the most successful reforms in Ukraine in the last 3 years was establishment of the new patrol police, in which if I'm not mistaken, both American and Canadian government and representatives were deeply involved, and it was a big success and it still is, because there's 94% new personnel, trained, new uniforms, new cars. We basically eradicated petty corruption on the road. What was a trademark thing for a post-Soviet state, that you can't go 5 kilometers without being stripped of some sum of money. Now there are guys who look and act like real police. On the other hand, the rest of the police, which is not a front office, which is anything that is not patrol police on the road, is still pretty much unreformed. So whatever the decisions that are made by these authorities are not as good. And the guys on the road, they're not decision makers in the system. So a lot of reforms are needed, both in terms of not only with the police, but with other law enforcement bodies. And also, I have to admit, also continuing the previous line, that if there is a strong civil society actor who pushes for certain things, they tend to happen. Anti-corruption, judicial reform, some parts of law enforcement bodies. But when, probably the biggest anti-example of reforms is a so-called reform of the prosecution that failed miserably. That's because there was very little, if any, public oversight in there. So that is why, again, I have to stress that the role of the civil society is crucial in Ukraine's transformation, and we now absolutely have to protect what is there in order to progress. Thank you.
Thanks. Any more questions, please, comments? We have like 6 minutes more. Marcin Święcicki, maybe? Yeah? Okay. I mean, floor is yours.
I have just small comments. I'm a bit jealous for all of this period, 2 weeks. In all side events, you are quite active, and unfortunately, I'm sad for we are not involved to these important discussions, because all problems which is you are explained here, we have also in Azerbaijan, and just 2 weeks before, all world discuss bigger money laundering scandal, which is shows how the Azerbaijani government launder billions and spent hundreds of millions for bribery, which is make serious negative feedback for security and stability in OSCE area and especially in Europe. And we call to all European countries strongly investigated all of these money laundering issues, because we are, as like human rights defenders, we are not like police or Interpol or prosecutors. We are just public defenders. We are make serious alerts, and you need to investigate it, all of this, and special all of thanks for all delegations which has come there, and please always check all of these alerts, especially with money laundering, because until you are provided these mechanisms to authoritarian regimes as like in Azerbaijan or in Moldova and in other state, this is same body, the same mechanism, companies which is involved to this corruption scandal also participated in money laundering mechanism which is established by Russia officials, and this issues with 20 billion money laundering. Thank you. And next time invited also us.
Next time, you are very welcome to be a part of our speakers. So, any more questions? If not, I will finish our discussion with one main request for all delegation and our guests. We have to protect concrete people if we want to have those who fight for reforms and who fight for human rights in such countries like here presented. It's concrete people who actually give their lives, give their thoughts, basically they risk with everything, and the only what we can do to support them if we don't want to have tragic developments in this country, we have to protect them. So all what we as Open Dialog Foundation, and I think everyone here will support my request, would kindly ask from your side, please support individual case mentioned in our reports. It's not only systematic problems, but it's also more concrete things which we could explain to people why they have to fight, why they have to believe that they are not alone. It's very important for everyone who is detained, everyone who is fight, that he is not alone. So this is our role and what we try to bring, why we ask all of our guests to give their personal testimonies, to share their personal point of views during such kind of events. And I thank you very much for coming, even nevertheless it's evening and it's quite late. And also from the organizers of OSCE, I would like to invite you to Australian Chairship reception. Its buses are waiting at a gate 6. So everyone who wants to get to reception, gate 6, very, very welcome. 1945 bus is leaving. Thank you very much. Thank you.